I want to welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see that we have so far about 46 participants, and that number is still climbing. So we're really, really happy that you're here with us for this conversation this evening about recovering the voices of Catholic women. We have two terrific panelists who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment, and I'm going to hand it over to them for a very conversational style presentation. And at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. So I encourage you to please use the Q&A box. I'll check the chat box as well, but please try to use the Q&A box for any questions that you have. I'm going to those and sharing them with our panelists at the right time and in due time in our presentation this evening, so that our panelists can address those. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to introduce both of our panelists and turn it over to them. So first, I want to introduce Mary Kate Holman. She's an assistant professor of theology at Benedictine University in the suburbs of Chicago. Her current book project explores the socially engaged ecclesiology of the French theologian Marie-Dominique Chenu, and she recently collaborated with Joseph Kamanchak on translation of Chenu's Saul Choir, A School of Theology. Her other research areas include feminist theology and Ignatian spirituality. Among other projects, she serves as co-editor of the Political Theology Network's Catholic Revisions blog. So welcome, Mary Kate. Elissa Cutter is an assistant professor of religious studies and theology at Georgian University. She received her Ph.D. in historical theology from St. Louis University. Her current research explores the methodological question of what characterizes feminist historical theology, while recovering the voice of Mother Angelique Arnaud, abbess of the allegedly Jansenist convent of Port Royal, as a theologian. Alongside this research, she is working on a translation of Mother Angelique's writings on reform to be published as part of the Other Voice in Early Modern Europe series. She is also co-editor of the blog Women in Theology. So I'm turning it over to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for agreeing to moderate our session. And thank you for Mary Kate for joining me in this. So I wanted to start off today by talking about this research that Joanne mentioned about feminist historical theology as a way to frame the conversation that we are going to have. This is a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. Basically, what am I doing in my research? And the starting point for our discussion, I want to talk a little bit about the definition of historical theology. I find this to be a very ill-defined field, especially in terms of how it relates to other fields, especially in comparison to, say, church history. Was there a difference between church history and historical theology? So I have a quote for you. It's kind of long, but I think it really epitomizes what I'm thinking about when I think about historical theology. This is from an article in the U.S. Catholic Historian by Patrick Carey. And he says, quote, "The primary focus of historical theology, as I understand it, is the investigation and understanding of the theological tradition, not as a representative of a dead past, but as a living reality. Past theological ideas are not merely past, but are part of the tradition that lives on in liturgies, prayer, conciliar decisions, current theological discussions, and official ecclesial pronouncements. No doubt there is much in the theological systems and conceptualizations of the past and the present that is conditioned by social, intellectual, especially philosophical, political, ecclesiastical, economic, and psychological forces. Historical theology tries to shed light on the ideas and the tradition that transcend the multiple historical incarnations and on the ideas and systems of theological thinking that have either been captured by the times in which they emerge or were so conditioned by the languages and conceptions of their day that they have outlived their usefulness and are alien to the contemporary world for which historical theologians write." So just to highlight some of the key points in that, first is the idea of tradition in the Catholic Church. And that means that we don't just discard things from the past, but they live on in what we have in the present. But of course, ideas are historically conditioned. People are not free of their historical context. So as I see it, the goal of historical theology is to evaluate the ideas in their context in order to understand both what might be too historically conditioned to be relevant today and what we want to recapture or what can speak to the context of the church today. Feminist historical theology uses a feminist lens to do that work, namely evaluating whether the ideas are liberative or oppressive to women. Now, it's important in this that we recognize that this approach is very much justified by the teachings of the Catholic Church. So one that I draw on a lot is the idea of human dignity in the tradition of Catholic social teaching. So in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, it defines human dignity as the ultimate foundation of the radical equality among all people, regardless of their race, nation, sex, origin, culture, or class. Then later, in the context of work, the compendium says that the feminine genius is needed in all expressions in the life of society, and this includes the Catholic tradition. Also important in all this is John Paul II's 1995 letter to women. And again, I'm going to quote this. It's a longer quote, but I think it's very significant. He says, "Yes, it is time to examine the past with courage, to assign responsibility where it is due in a review of the long history of humanity. Women have contributed to that history as much as men, and more often than not, they did so in much more difficult conditions. I think particularly of those women who loved culture and art and devoted their lives to them in spite of the fact that they were frequently at a disadvantage from the start, excluded from equal educational opportunities, underestimated, ignored, and not given credit for their intellectual contributions. Sadly, very little of women's achievements in history can be registered by the science of history. But even though time may have buried the documentary evidence of those achievements, their beneficent influence can be felt as a force which has shaped the lives of successive generations right up to our own. To this great, immense feminine tradition, humanity owes a debt which can never be repaid." So this quote I find significant because it gets at the difficulty in the recovery of women's theological voices in history. So he talks about how they were excluded from equal educational opportunities, underestimated, ignored, and not given credit for their intellectual contributions. And so in terms of feminist historical theology, we need a slightly different method when we're looking for women's voices in history, because it can be more of a challenge to trace some of the documentary evidence. They were less likely to be published. They were less likely to be conserved in full, and that's especially true at certain points in history. Especially from the perspective of my period of history, which is the early modern era, men are often writing books, treatises, polemics, texts that are making very distinct arguments about whatever topic they're addressing. Women were barred from formal, higher, at least, educational institutions for much of history. And this rise of the universities led to a professionalization in theology that was not permitted to women for a long time. And these women in this period were often not even permitted to write in the same genres of text that these men were. Not saying that they weren't educated at all, of course, and not saying that they couldn't write theology, just that they did so using different genres than were permitted to men. And this was actually a point that was raised by Elizabeth Huddleston at the roundtable event that I was at a few weekends ago at the National Institute for Newman Studies. She argued that we need to read women's writings in the same way we would look at texts like poetry or works of fiction. All of those things can be read theologically, so can these writings of women. We just have to recognize that they're not making always a straightforward argument about their views. Rather, you have to discern their theological views from what they're saying in other contexts. Finally, I just want to note that in my methods, I draw inspiration from a lot of the prior feminist theologians, though many of them do not self-identify as historical theologians. So in a sense, this isn't a brand new project or a brand new method, but I think it's one that has yet to be explicitly identified as such. So I just want to note 3 books that have really inspired me in my work. The first is by Elizabeth Johnson. It's her work, Friends of God and Prophets, which is on the communion of saints. And Elizabeth Johnson, of course, works primarily in systematic theology. the method in her book really resonated with how I think about feminist theology. She talks about the idea of combining the retrieval of women's voices in history with feminist theological reflection. So the historical work combined with the theological work is an interdisciplinary historical theology. That's really what I see as it. She also talks about how we're dealing with the way that sources are distorted by patriarchy. And she pushes for feminist methods of memory. So to recover the stories of women who have been pushed aside or ignored, to examine the historical tradition, to retell stories more accurately, return to historical evidence to reevaluate the value of stories, and examine evidence for anonymous women in the tradition. Another source of inspiration for me is Elizabeth Schuster-Ferenza's In Memory of Her. She's, of course, known primarily for her work in biblical theology, but I think there are some overlaps between historical critical methods in biblical theology and the work of historical theology. She talks about in that book about how it's not just about reinserting women into history, but claiming that history for women. And she says that we begin our work from an assumption that women did contribute to history. So I have a quote from the introduction. She says, rather than demand that feminist historians prove that women actively participated in a certain historical period, the feminist rule insists that one needs to make a case that they did not. And then she outlines basically 5 premises for doing a feminist historical theology, or that I take for my feminist historical theology. First is this assumption that women were historical agents and had ideas of their own. Second, a recognition that all texts were written in a patriarchal androcentric culture, knowing we particularly need a hermeneutic of suspicion when we're looking at text by men about women, but also remembering that women's texts can also reflect this patriarchal androcentric mindset. And then she emphasizes the idea of a use of a historical imagination to reconstruct the silences of history. Finally, the other source of inspiration for me is Mary Ann Majewski, whose work Women at the Table is recovering narrative forms of theology in the medieval era. So she's a medievalist. She's also the only one of these 3 who really self-identifies as doing historical theology. Her argument in that book is that the focus of the tradition in the medieval period has been so much on scholastic texts that it had blinded us to the fullness of the tradition. And she especially focuses, as I said, on narrative texts, the writings of saints' lives. And in her introduction, she talks about explicitly borrowing from historical critical methods of biblical exegesis. So she says it's important to first understand texts in their context as much as possible, but also place the text in the broader context of the Christian tradition, especially what had come before, to do a close theological reading of the text and then synthesize the theological view found in the text. When I first read this book, I loved this because I was like, this is what I've been doing. And someone has kind of articulated this in a way that I hadn't thought through before. And that really kind of pushed me on this search for defining this methodology. So what I draw from all of these kind of in summary is that when we do feminist historical theology, we have to first start from this assumption that women have been doing theology throughout the whole Christian tradition. That is the starting point. We take the texts that we're reading and first we understand them in their own historical context, because if you take them out of context, you're going to misinterpret them. We also have to place them in the broader Christian tradition, understand how their ideas fit with other people who have come before. And then we approach the text to do a theological reading of the text. This is where I bring in this idea, of course, of the hermeneutic of suspicion in relation to the ever-present patriarchal context. So can these aspects be explained by the historical context in some ways? Also, the theological evaluation that I mentioned in the beginning. Are the claims being made in these texts ultimately liberative or oppressive to women? From this, we can reconstruct the theology of the authors. And the overall aim in all of this is a recovery of women's voices and contributions. Sometimes this will involve a reevaluation of the evidence and, of course, the use of historical imagination to fill in some of the silences. So I've been talking a lot just to kind of give us an overview of where we're going to be. I want to now turn it to Mary Kate and ask you about your work. If you could talk a little bit about how your present work is contributing to this recovery of women's voices for the Catholic tradition.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks to Georgian Court for hosting this and for having me. And thank you, Elissa, for that really helpful anchoring and orienting introduction. I was taking notes. Like, I have insights now about my own work based on your description of this method here. I always think that the research that we do is so tied to the personal. So I'm going to share sort of, and I think this will be illuminating of the silences that often come from feminist theology. So I'm going to start with a slightly embarrassing admission, which is that when I started studying theology as I was an undergraduate minor in theology, and I genuinely thought that I was the first person to think that we should combine the Catholic tradition with feminist insights, because I had been raised in a Catholic tradition that hadn't really mentioned the word feminist very much. And when I was then introduced to that concept as an undergraduate, I thought, well, I'm going to be a feminist theologian, and that doesn't exist. And what I think this is important to point out, because obviously I have now studied with some of the theologians that you have just mentioned who were pioneers in the method of feminist theology, but outside of the world of academic theology, in the world of sort of more mainstream in the pews Catholicism, these insights have not necessarily percolated in. And so there is a sense, I can't remember the author, but there's this insight that because women's voices keep getting excluded, each generation of women feel like we have to reinvent the wheel or be the first. And what I'm really excited about that you're pointing out in this method, Elissa, is a recognition that we are not the first. Not only have there been generations before us now that have been explicitly engaged in the work of academic feminist theology, but even prior to that, in every generation, there have in fact been these women. But it makes it so much harder than, again, every generation if we forget their insights. So you asked how my work contributes to this recovery of women's voices. And I will say, despite my early commitment as an undergraduate to feminist theology, my dissertation, which is now my first book project that was mentioned in the introduction, actually is about a man, unfortunately, about a white European ordained man. And I found myself often as I was in the archives, so Marie-Dominique Chenu was a 20th century French theologian. In his archives, I found myself repeatedly asking, I think I'm a feminist. Why am I working on this figure? But one of the things that I started to realize, and which has now paved the way for a second, more explicitly feminist project, were the ways that women appeared in letters, right? Very rarely in explicit theological texts. And Chenu's lifetime spanned almost the entire 20th century, 1895 to 1990. So women were starting to study theology, but most of the people that Chenu was corresponding with were men and were clergy. And the actual number of lay people that he corresponded with was much higher, I think, than most clergy at that time. That's part of why it's exciting to study him. But given the clerical and patriarchal structure of the Roman Catholic Church, most of the theologians that were recognized as such were men. And as I was writing the chapter on Vatican II, I found a woman mentioned in a footnote, and she really caught my attention. So I will tell just a brief bit of her story. I'm still in the process of unpacking it, and then I can talk a little bit about why I think this is theology rather than just purely history. So at the Second Vatican Council, a group of mostly clergy deliberating on all of these doctrinal and these doctrinal issues and ecclesial practices, there was a smaller lobbying group called the Church of the Poor Working Group that was run by priests and bishops trying to bring the role of the poor and the plight of the poor more actively into the consciousness of the bishops that were at Vatican II. And it said in one footnote in some French book that I was reading that the Church of the Poor Working Group was led by this priest named Paul Gautier. And it mentions like his faithful companion, Marie-Thérèse Lacaze. That sort of led me down a rabbit hole search because I was determined to make her more than a footnote in this chapter. And she had only ever sort of been in footnotes. And since then, I have now decided I have a blog post on Catholic Revisions about her, and I plan on featuring her in a later book that more explicitly tells the stories of women in the 20th century trying to reform the church. So she and Paul Gautier lived in Nazareth, actually. They were both French, but they had started a worker community there to be in solidarity with those that were marginalized in the Middle East. They then went on to found this Church of the Poor Working Group together, but I have now since found her memoir, which is of course out of print and not translated anywhere, that recounts this feeling of being marginalized, even though she was functionally the partner of this theologian, this priest that was given so much more attention. Their life story ends up becoming so interesting. They both end up, they end up getting married. They end up traveling to Brazil. They have sort of a global liberation theology adventure. And even, when they get married, the story in the French press is like famous French priest gets married. It barely even mentions her. So I think she was a theologian, but she was eclipsed. And it was interesting. One of the things I find so interesting is that she would not have even had access to the Second Vatican Council if it had not been for this relationship with a priest. So she, on the one hand, was an insider in the way that most women could not be, and still really can't be, right, at the Vatican. But at the same time, her description of Vatican II says, the number of bishops that could even look at me, that could deign to speak to a woman, were very small. And so it's not that she wasn't a theologian, it was that those that got to designate who is a theologian didn't recognize her as such. And so my work, as I move beyond the Chenu book, I'm seeking to tell stories, which does feel more like history than theology, of women in the 20th and 21st centuries that have attempted to reform the church in some way, making theological arguments about why the church ought to be different. And in so doing, looking not only at their writings, because as you mentioned, Elissa, often those are either out of print or in a different genre or letters or whatever. They're not necessarily academic articles. So their writings, yes, but then also their lives. And that I think is sort of key to the methodology that I am bringing to this. I think that people's lives are a genuine expression of their theology. And to use an example of a man who this is very much true, but it might crystallize the point, Oscar Romero, people now think of as a beautiful theologian who had these ideas about the Church of the Poor and about martyrdom and, liberation theology. But he was less of an ideas man, and it was his life and his leadership and then his death as a martyr that ended up making him the figure that he is. His life was a genuine expression of his theology. And so one of the approaches that I am taking with these women is to mine not only their thought, but also their lives for the theology that are contained therein. So I'll just say one more thing, and then I want to hear more about your work, Elissa. My work is in historical theology, but also then in ecclesiology, which I think overlaps, because ecclesiology is the study of the church, both theologically, but also obviously then in its instantiations and its historical context. And so church documents and the way the church describes itself matter for this discipline. So there's a quote that just came out in the document for the continental stage of the synod that is ongoing right now. And thinkers like Maureen O'Connell and Susan Reynolds have brought this quote to my attention, and I'm very excited about it. This synod describes, this document describes women as those who are most committed to the synod. And it says, quote, who seem to have realized not only that they have more to gain, but also more to offer by being relegated to a prophetic edge from which they observe what happens in the life of the church. And so I guess that's sort of my contention, that I think feminist historical theology itself exists on the prophetic edge. And often when the, I don't want to say mainstream church, but sort of if there are concentric circles around what it means to be church, those marginalized are perhaps realizing the gospel more than those that are at the center of power. And so I think that this kind of work has a lot to offer, not only academically, but to the life of the church. So I now feel like I've talked for a long time, and I look forward to having more of a conversation. But Elissa, maybe you could talk about your work. I know it's in an earlier time period than mine, and so your approach might be slightly different.
Actually, the funny thing is, as you were talking, I mean, every time we have conversations about this, I see more and more points of connection. And so I love that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those points of connection, but just to kind of introduce to other people who may not be familiar with my area of research, I work on the Port Royal nuns. My specific focus is Mother Angelique Arnaud, who reformed the convent in the early 17th century and was very well known in France for her reforming efforts. Before then, the convent got embroiled in the Jansenist controversy. So I like, when I introduce myself at the beginning of the semester to my students all the time, I tell them I work on allegedly heretical nuns, because the connection between Jansenism and, you know, whether the ideas are heretical and, like, you know, all of this stuff is just very interesting to me. How much did the nuns kind of buy into some of this theology that was being expressed by some of the men? And then also Angelique very much interested me because, especially her reform, it's all happening before Jansenism as a thing exists. If we can even call Jansenism a thing, which is a whole nother question that I like to explore. But and so it's interesting to me to see what is going on, you know, in her early reforms, in her early writings as we can get. Most of the stuff comes from later, unfortunately, which is already tainted by the kind of Jansenist controversy, because that's why they kept a lot of their writings. But yeah, I guess I should say a little bit about Angelique. So she became abbess at Port Royal at age of just before age 11. Basically, she was 10 and some months when she took the position because the former abbess had died. So, you know, talking about the unreformed state of the convent when she became abbess, like, that itself is evidence of what was going on. And she really disliked her religious life. She was very unhappy as a nun. She was allegedly tempted, no, I don't want to say allegedly, she was tempted to potentially leave and get married. She had Protestant relatives who kind of came and said, you know, you were put in this position before you came of age, so you can leave if you want to. But then one night she went to this sermon by a visiting preacher who talked about the incarnation and the idea of Christ's humility and becoming human. And she talked about that moment. She said, God touched me in that moment, and there was nothing that I would want to do if he would not continue the grace that he had given me. That's a very loose paraphrase of what she said. But basically, from that moment on, she starts to reform. Well, she starts initially to reform herself, but then realizes as abbess, in order to reform herself, she has to reform her convent. And so part of what even kind of, I don't know, the Jansenist controversy can't be told without these women. It's kind of first part of the story. But I did want to comment on, you were talking about the expressions of people's lives as expressions of their theology. And you mentioned Romero as a theologian, people recognizing Romero as a theologian. And one of the things that I think, especially when we're looking at my period, but people do that more easily to male figures than they do to women. That is such a good point. Yeah, exactly. So one of the arguments actually that I made, I hadn't thought about this, but as you were talking about it, and in this period in France, there was this whole idea of the science of the saints. It's tied to the French school of spirituality. It was very much promoted by Saint Cyran, but it was this idea that theology is expressed not only through what people say, but what they do. And so women could be theologians by living out things as opposed to just kind of saying things. But I am also interested, of course, in their writings. And the thing that I like about the Port Royal nuns is because they were being persecuted, there was this whole effort to write down the history of the convent, to record what was going on. And so we have more writings from them than almost any other convent from this time period. So that is kind of the other thing that really interests me about them in particular. So I wanted to talk about, so one of the things about thinking about their writings, I know that for me, like I said before, because they're writing in different genres, I have to approach their text in slightly different ways. And you talked about looking at her autobiography. So maybe you could talk about, like, are there any kind of particular methods that you need to use when you're approaching your sources that are different than when you're, say, reading Aquinas?
Yes, so many. The first is just time periods vary. A lot of the women that I'm thinking about, and Marie-Thérèse Lacaze is an example of this, are deceased in the last 20-ish years. Some of the folks that I might want to put into conversation with them are actually still living. And so I think that it's interesting then when historical theology can have like a sort of more ethnographic or, conversational aspect of it. There are some folks that I plan on actually interviewing for this project, which obviously is something that I'm sure you wish you could do with Mother Angelique. But for someone like Marie-Thérèse Lacaze, I found myself, after finishing her autobiography, she mentions that she and Paul adopted 2 children. And I have been Googling, they mentioned what they named their children. And I actually found, I don't have Facebook right now, but I found like a Facebook page of, I am pretty sure it is Marie-Thérèse Lacaze's son. And, so I found his email address and sent him what must have sounded like a crazy email. And I have not heard back from him. So I mean, I need to be more persistent. That was a couple months ago. I haven't followed up, but I think that especially given the fact that, there were news stories about her husband that did not include her. There is more digging. There is more, trying to find connections or people or mentions of her. I gave a paper at the American Academy of Religion in November, and she was one of the figures I talked about. And an Australian scholar of the Belgian bishop, Joseph Cardine, came up to me at the end and said, "Oh, there are letters from her and from Paul in Cardine's archives. I think I have photos. Let me send them to you." And so it's like the double layer of, I'm searching for people that knew them, and then knowing people that have found something in an elusive archive. She doesn't have an archive, so you have to find her in other people's archives as well. And a lot of these archives, I'm not sure what yours look like in your time period, Elissa, but they're not particularly well documented, and they definitely don't have online finders, finder aids. And so it really is more interpersonal, which is interesting because that's kind of the way that Marie-Thérèse and others made a difference in their own theologies, right? In the interpersonal, because they weren't in these official channels. So I almost feel like I'm replicating some of her work and then doing my own. So interpersonal things, interviews, those I think are probably, and then also just in reading someone's memoir, I do think that you need to have a sort of critical lens. And I'm sure you feel similarly, as she is self-reporting towards the end of her life, she and Paul actually sort of distanced themselves from Catholicism. They were very disillusioned by the ways that Catholicism seemed to align itself more with the powerful and the wealthy, both in Palestine and then in Brazil. I think they were also sort of frustrated with the way she was treated as a woman, the way that he was treated as a former priest. And so they distanced themselves from Catholicism. So their narrative, or her narrative in her autobiography, is almost looking back, sort of projecting that narrative arc onto it. But underneath it, then I think I kind of have to read, and perhaps more archived letters will help construct the story differently. What were they thinking at the time? You know, Google's also super helpful. I now, at least, you know, like I found a Brazilian language text of a bishop at Vatican II who knew her and mentions her. And then I'm like copying and pasting the Portuguese from the Google book into the Google Translate. And, you know, again, these don't feel like very scholarly avenues of research, but sort of combining that with then the more critical theological concepts, it's sort of, yeah, you have to dig to find these women, but they are there, and they are there in spades. Obviously, I guess, you know, interviewing people is not going to be possible for you, Elissa. So what's your kind of methodology for uncovering these sources and these voices?
Yeah, like I said, the sources are actually, I mean, I don't want to say accessible in that, like, more or less, other than the things that have been digitized by the Bibliothèque Nationale, you do have to kind of go to France to get access to these sources. But as I said, the nuns were very deliberate in saving things and copying them. And so there are copies of their works in kind of several archives. And there are people who are now working to publish critical editions of these texts, which is wonderful. So in terms of kind of like particular methods for me, a big thing that I think about is like, how do I read these texts? So one of the things that I always kind of start about is in this whole controversy over Jansenism, the nuns were asked to sign a formulary which condemned Cornelius Jansen's Augustinus, or 5 propositions allegedly drawn from Cornelius Jansen's Augustinus. And so in the kind of subsequent controversy and the nuns' refusal to sign this, they emphasized their ignorance. So, you know, their whole argument was, you know, we're not allowed to read this text. We're just poor nuns who are trying to live our lives in piety. You know, please don't bother us, type of thing. Even their defenders, you know, kind of took that stance in their kind of polemical works. But we have to understand then these claims to ignorance in the polemical context and not take them, of course, at face value. In terms of Mother Angelique and her writings, she has, you know, this text of an autobiography. So similar things for you, I imagine. Always thinking about intended audience, who is going to read this text, who are they writing this text for? And then for her text in particular, I've worked on this before in terms of the idea that, you know, early modern autobiography is not the same as a modern autobiography, and especially in relation to kind of her intent to describe herself, rather than the intent was not to describe oneself as an individual, but rather to provide an edifying model for others to follow, and one that would be along the lines of other models. So I've used this genre from kind of medieval work of autohagiography of what she is doing in writing this text, and thinking about it through that lens helps you to really kind of understand what are the theological ideas that she's exploring in this process of telling her story. She just has discourses on, for example, the Rule of St. Benedict, which are a little bit more straightforward. But again, there are kind of multiple layers. First, she probably didn't write them out as we have them. They were reconstituted from notes, likely taken from her niece, Angelique de Saint-Jean. So whether the discourse corresponds to exactly what she gave, we can never really know that. But you also have to think about the context in which she's giving this. So this is in the chapter with the nuns. They would read a chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict. This would be followed by a discourse from the superior, who would, in this discourse, note the faults of the community, which would then be followed by basically individual nuns accusing themselves of their faults. So there is very much a context to every single one of these. And again, you have to discern the theological ideas around kind of what is the context as well. The other thing she has are letters. And some of these are just kind of, letters talking about who came to the convent and, where and when and who she was talking to. She also has letters of spiritual direction that she writes to women outside the convent. And letters were a significant source for theology in the early modern era. But again, you have to think about intended recipient. The nuns copied these letters to save them, so there are probably copying errors. So again, there's this disconnect between, like you said, I would love to have been able to talk to her, because there is a space that I cannot cross between what actually was and the record that we have. I can only do my best, and that's where it gets into this kind of idea of the historical imagination as well. Of course, the other thing in all of these writings is this idea of rhetoric of humility and submission that the women were constantly using. I don't want to write this text. I'm doing so because I'm ordered by my confessor. This is pretty standard stuff. Even the letters, she writes to her younger brother who was a priest. And so there is this weird dynamic of her as older sister kind of giving him advice, but also addressing him as my dear father, So all of these kind of considerations really get it. We have to understand what's going on in the historical context. We have to see look at these texts in their context to understand how to then interpret them. And that's why I think this feminist historical theology is such an important project.
Can I just briefly respond, and then I know we want to expand it to the audience, but one thing that I think is really interesting is we haven't talked about this before, but it's an obvious connection that we both are focusing on women reformers. And I'm wondering if, again, there's something about being on the quote unquote prophetic edge that, the women who are frustrated or dissatisfied with something in the ecclesiastical sphere are the people that are more likely to be then doing this project of theology. And both received blowback from the church. And my bigger project, again, expands beyond Marie Therese to look at these other women who attempt to reform the church. And even what you were talking about in terms of the rhetorical strategy. I just checked the participant list to make sure that this person is not on the call. She's not. So one of the figures I'm thinking about is the very much still living Phyllis Zagano, who is a very strong advocate for women deacons. And she is a woman that has gotten into literally the halls of power at the Vatican and has served on papal commissions about this question. And I think the only reason that she has been able to sort of thread that needle is because she's very careful to never expand the argument to what I think is its logical conclusion about priesthood. It's always very focused on the diaconate, and she has never said that that's strategic. And again, even though she's living, I feel like I'm kind of doing the rhetorical analysis to figure out, well, what is the full extent of this theology or its implications? And so I think this is probably true of all thinkers throughout time, but particularly with women, particularly in the very hierarchical Catholic Church, it's sort of remarkable how playing with relationship to authority, whether that's in the 17th century or the 21st century, is still very much part of what has to get unpacked in recognizing the theology behind these ideas. Okay.
I know we want to take questions too, but what you were saying, I have a post that I wrote on the Women in Theology blog that I actually will hopefully be coming out in a book form, or not my book, but as a chapter in a book, but where I talk a little bit about the difficulty that I originally had in self-identifying as a theologian, because as an undergraduate, I never had a female teacher in theology. They were mostly men, mostly Jesuits. And so that was what a theologian was to me. And then I went to a seminary for my master's, and there were women there, and I had women, but they were all also religious. So there's separation. It wasn't until I got to my doctoral program that I had a lay female professor who identified as a theologian, and so I think that some of the struggle for me personally to claim that role is, it's all compounded. It's this kind of tentativeness that we have about our voices.
Yeah.
And the tentativeness that was compounded by not having any other models of who were doing this for me.
But now you're a model for your students.
Yeah, I try to be. So.
Well, this is so amazing. This is a great conversation. And I wanted, is this a good time maybe to open it up to some questions?
Sure.
I will just share in the Q&A, we have a comment from Pamela Rader. Merci beaucoup. Thank you both for sharing your work and excitement for your work. And I have a question here. To what extent? Okay, so I'm going to read this question. It comes from Richard Yoder. Thank you both for this excellent conversation. For Elissa, as a historian who also works on Jansenist women, albeit in the 18th century, I'm curious as to what kinds of problems arise for a project that is meant to put Port Royal in conversation with contemporary Catholic theology. To what extent, it looks like this is all familiar to you, to what extent, if at all, must that project become in some sense a revisionist assessment of Jansenist theology and spirituality per se?
Yes, absolutely. I actually figured that someone was going to ask me that. So I was already kind of thinking about it. And so the thing about Jansenism is that it's a term that still has life. It is thrown around a lot these days. I feel like, especially since Pope Francis, I started seeing it as, now this Jesuit Jansenist conflict has continued, today. And so, yes, absolutely, there is a sense that I think that we need to look at what Jansenism is, and if it is anything at all. I don't have a fully satisfactory answer to that, though I have written some things about defining Jansenism and some of the difficulties in that, namely that all of the tendencies that we tend to point to as being Jansenist were basically just 17th century French tendencies. And so it's hard to say, that makes someone a Jansenist per se. Sorry, I lost my train of thought about that. Absolutely, I have to rethink what Jansenism is, but I also rethink it in relation to the nuns in particular. So that's another thing that is kind of part of this project, is even if Jansenism is a thing, which is kind of this separate question, like, is the nuns' theology reflective of that? So I've done a presentation for the Catholic Theological Society of America many years ago on Mother Angelique's theology of grace, because Jansenism is often known by an Augustinian theology of grace, and it's a heresy about grace. And so if you look at her theology in relation to kind of some of the ways that we define a Jansenist theology of grace, it doesn't fully fit with that. There are some tendencies that, yes, fit in with that tendency, but there are also some other tendencies. And I think part of that has to do with the vast number of influences that she had on her early life and her early reform, that we can't really, so kind of there's two questions, is the Jansenism question, but also, is Mother Angelique herself a Jansenist? And I still haven't fully answered that, but I'm leaning towards perhaps not.
I just want to jump in because it's just amazing. I feel like sometimes we get so siloed in our different historical periods, and this is the exact same conversation that is happening in the 20th century with modernism. And in the same way, like Pope Francis keeps getting accused of being a modernist pope and all you modernist theologians, but like all of the people that were accused of modernism in the late 19th and up to mid 20th century, none of them like belonged to a movement that they were like, we are called the modernists. And so it's like, is there a there? Is that even really a thing? And so it's just very interesting, you know, that's more with my work on Chanu, less about women that I've been looking at, but it is amazing that these recurring accusations of heresy, which didn't even really feel just to the people that were accused of it in their respective time periods, are now getting like reappropriated as an accusation for now when, yeah, anyway, I just think that as I was listening to that, I was like, we could have been having the exact same conversation about modernism.
I wanted to follow up just a little. I wonder, because I know, yeah, I don't want this to take a long time, but I know there are a lot of students on in this presentation, and maybe many others who would benefit from a very brief definition of a conventional understanding of what Jansenism is.
Yes, of course. Sorry. So Jansenism is a heresy named after Cornelius Jansen, who wrote a book called the Augustinus, which purported to set out Augustine's theology of grace. And in general, when we look back at Jansenism, there are kind of three characteristics that we tend to use to define Jansenism. These are these characteristics that I said are super prevalent in 17th century France as well. So the first is the Augustinian theology of grace. 17th century France is called often the century of St. Augustine. There is rigorous spiritual practices, especially in relation to waiting till one is truly sorry for one's sins for confession and abstaining from the Eucharist because of this, need to feel truly sorry for one's sins. And that is also prevalent in 17th century France. Antoine Arnaud's On Frequent Communion was vastly popular, not just among Jansenists. And then the other thing is the hatred of the Jesuits, because they were on opposite sides of this conversation. And one of the things that I often say when I've taught the Jesuits in the past, and I only am partly tongue-in-cheek when I say this, is that everyone everywhere has always hated the Jesuits because they've always been attacked by someone somewhere at some point for something, alas. So that is my basic definition of Jansenism. Obviously, it can be more complicated, but.
Thank you so much. We have another question. Thank you both for doing this work and sharing with us this evening. Do you feel that recovering these women's voices in this moment in time will now stick? That is, what is the overall environment like for reception of women's theological history in the church? She said, thank you.
That's such a great question. I think right now there is well, this is true of the American context. This might not be true globally. And I want to acknowledge that Catholicism is a global reality. Thank God it's not just the American context. I think in the American context right now, there is a big disconnect between academic theology and then what is happening in diocesan seminaries, and therefore what is sort of being preached in the pulpits. And so if my former undergraduate self, who I referenced at the beginning of this talk, most of the undergraduates that I teach haven't really heard very much about women or women theologians, or even all of the women that appear throughout the Bible, right? But I do think that academic theology has reached a point where, at least at most universities in the United States, it would sort of be weird to have or I would think like it was weird and you didn't do your due diligence if there was not a single woman on your syllabus, for example. So I think it kind of depends. Like it is sticking in certain contexts, but in terms of average, everyday, people in the pews Catholicism, that's where I'm hoping. And I know there's a lot of talk being done right now about how maybe we could better bridge this divide between academic theology and then how it is practiced day to day in the pews. Because if we're doing this feminist retrieval work, but it's not percolating out into the wider church, then I think that that's a really big missed opportunity. I don't know. What do you think, Elissa?
You basically answered that question the same way that I would have answered that question. I don't know that I have anything that I can add to that. The one thing that I was thinking about when you were when you were talking was about, this idea that it's not getting out to the kind of average Catholic. Is when I was in graduate school, I had a chance to teach a class on the history of Christianity. And I decided that in doing this, I was going to only use primary sources of women's writings. It wasn't fully perfect. Some of them were kind of men's writings that were in reference to women. But I tried to do that as much as possible for every period of the history of the church. And the reviews on my course evaluations they went two ways. One was, this is so amazing. I never knew about this stuff. This is the greatest kind of class I've ever taken. And this is a crazy feminist, man-hating teacher, whatever, So
why didn't we do real theology?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
So I think in some ways, I don't have an answer to how we can kind of get this out of kind of the academic context to everyone else. Fully, other than the stuff that we both do in terms of writing on blogs and making our writing available. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, it's funny, again, it didn't occur to me, we have so many similarities, Elissa, at the end of both of our bios, and it was like the co-editor of this blog, the co-editor of this one. But that, I think you're right, that does signify an attempt to make this accessible beyond a university classroom. Yeah, that's a good point. Again, how far of a reach that's actually having, I'm not sure, but I think, yeah, that's definitely a good faith effort that we're both making there.
Very good. I'm seeing some questions that are kind of leaning towards exactly what you were just talking about in terms of is this the moment, for this kind of thing to stick? I have another one that says, a lot of time, this is Elizabeth Huddleston, a lot of time we hear of women's writings in terms of spirituality rather than theology, when the context is clearly theological. Can either of you say anything about the spirituality theological divide and how women's voices have been relegated to the spiritual or devotional?
That is actually another one of my big kind of peeves about the way that I find this divide unhelpful is kind of the first thing. I know that there are people who specialize in spirituality, and I don't want to kind of diminish that work at all. But I think that especially when we're looking at women's writings, when we push them into spirituality, instead of identifying them as theology, it serves to make them seem as not important. And that is why kind of in my project, I've emphasized, I'm not reclaiming these women as spiritual writers. I don't think anyone would dispute that they were spiritual writers. I am reclaiming them as theologians, people who contributed to kind of the tradition of the church, even though it may be in ways that we don't really recognize. So I don't know, Mary Kate, if you have anything else that you want to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I definitely have seen the ways that women, it's kind of like, oh, that's spiritual, that's soft, whereas like men, it's, rigorous and philosophical or whatever. I actually find spirituality, some spirituality, sure, like popular spirituality might not be that theological, but spirituality actually is sort of like the most integrated reflection of a person's life, a person's prayer, and a person's theology. And by a person, I don't mean that in an individualized way, but like the way that gets instantiated in a particular person drawing on the tradition of the church. And so it's funny, I love teaching spirituality as theology. And again, I feel like I can always invoke a man to make the point that then sheds the light on the women. Ignatius, right? I know everybody hates the Jesuits, but I have used Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises as an introductory theological text because it shows the basic building blocks of Christian doctrine, but in a way that then people can find more relatable to their lives. So I think that division of theology and spirituality not only has been unhelpful in terms of a gender binary and the marginalization of women and of spirituality, but that's done a disservice to the spiritual dimension of theology as well. So I appreciate that question. And yeah, that harms everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. We don't all hate Jesuits, by the way. I just want to go on record for that. Um,
Elissa and I
Mary
went to
Kate
an
and I
undergraduate.
both definitely don't hate
As
Jesuits.
a scholar,
All of our degrees are from the
Ignatius.
Jesuits. Yep.
No, but I really appreciate that. I mean, that's something maybe that the modern era has lost, the essential unity of theology and spirituality. But I also appreciate what you're saying, Elissa, that because women's voices have so often been relegated to that's just spirituality, you know, there has to be some lifting up of their voices as specifically theological voices. I think I'm kind of, are there any other questions? I know it's 8:04 and we said we would end at 8. And I know we had a beautiful, nice, big, long question from Paul DuPont that Mary Kate answered. Thank you, at least partially. But I think
I didn't mean to, I think it got dismissed. Oh, it moved to the
no,
answer.
I mean,
Yeah.
I actually, I went over it because it's sort of some of what he was asking was really that about very similar to that. Is it going to stick now? Is this the moment? Is this the moment for this? So that's why I just want to say that to Paul. It was a terrific, great question, and I just if you think I didn't, or that answer didn't get, your question didn't get answered in that stick question, then please let me know. There was just one more question, which I think was about, any kind of challenges that you experience in analyzing the the primary text that you're using for your work. And I know that you went over a lot of that in your initial comments, but if you have anything else you want to say about that.
I mean, the other issue is, of course, the separation. I mean, I'm reading these texts in 17th century French. So there is kind of a separation there. Like, as you said in the introduction, I also work on, translations of Mother Angelique's writings. And one of the difficulties is the use of pronouns, where they will mention someone and then use pronouns for like the next paragraph. But you lose track of who they're referring to. And that's just kind of, how they were writing. And so yes, in some ways, like there is a level of interpretation that I have to do just to kind of understand sometimes what they're saying. But yeah, I mean, that's just one of the things that kind of stuck out to me in response to that. I don't know, Mary Kate, if yours.
Well, I mean, again, 20th century French is a little bit more accessible than 17th century French. But that's another overlap in our work. I don't even think we fully acknowledged. But yes, I mean, to have a foreign language and even a century later, I think it's spoken very differently. I feel like I know sort of slang French and then theological French. I'm constantly trying to negotiate. So the language question is also one too, for sure.
I wanted to ask Mary Kate, if you could in the chat or just tell us all or put it in the Q&A, the spelling for Marie Therese's last name.
Yeah. It's Lacaze. So I think I can only, the chat is only visible to the three of us, but
okay.
Yeah. There is really nothing about her in English that I have found except a blog post that I wrote about her in Catholic Revision. So I always feel weird plugging my own work, but unless you want to order an out of print and untranslated autobiography from the 70s on Amazon, then the blog post will do great.
You should mention the title of the autobiography too.
It is called, the translation is The End of Promised Lands, both because of her disillusionment with the state of Israel and her disillusionment with the Catholic Church in general. Yes, it is. It's very poetic. It's very beautiful.
I look forward to your translation of it into English.
Maybe.
among the other things that you have going in your project.
Maybe.
So I just want to thank both of you so much. I know we need to bring it to an end because of our time, but this has been such an amazing conversation, and it is really a joy to see the overlaps and your work, and to have you kind of talk about that, even though you're working on two very, very different periods. And I found this a very enlivening discussion, and I thank everyone who joined us. I think at our height we had about 46, so it was a really wonderful turnout. And Thank you. Thank you all. Any final words? And then we can say goodnight.
I'll just thank the Georgian court community for welcoming me from Chicago, the wonders of Zoom. And thanks to Elissa in particular. I can tell that this is in the early stages of a very long-term conversation we are going to be having over the course of our careers. So thank you all so much for listening.
Yeah, and I just want to add to thank you, Mary Kate, for agreeing to take part in this. And thank you to Jen to dealing with all the technology and getting us set up. I really appreciate all your help in putting this together.
Hey.
Amen.
All
Thank
right.
you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.